as a scholar and professor of black studies, you've described an ancient Africa that is very rich in its heritage and its civilization, its use of science, agriculture. Describe ancient Africa to us, the kind of Africa that you've been studying and unearthing.
We have images, and these images dominate us. These images dominate us, and the image of Africa has been totally destroyed by recent discoveries. It's just that most people do not know of those discoveries. And the discoveries are made by Euro-American scientists mainly. Peter Schmidt and Donald Avery, for example, discovered Africans were smelting steel 1,500 to 2,000 years ago. I'm going to use the conservative estimate, 1,500. They were smelting steel at a time when nobody in the world was smelting steel.
And using a one-stage process, apparently, too.
Well, what was so unusual about it is that they were preheating the air. And they had a system whereby because of preheating the air and because of the other things they introduced, they were able to achieve temperatures of 3,275 degrees Fahrenheit in the blast zone. That was never achieved until centuries later. Iron actually melts at 2,642 degrees Fahrenheit. So that when they achieved this 3,275 degrees Fahrenheit, carbon from the swamp grass which they introduced would invade the iron, producing carbon crystals. Therefore, they produced steel. This is by a very, they achieved temperatures about 200 to 400 degrees higher than anything achieved in Europe or elsewhere. And this is long in advance of the production of steel. And the East Indians from India would come into the port of Dar es Salaam. They would pick up this steel, which they call Wu steel, and they exported it to Europe. And Europe made Damascus swords. So the finest swords in the world were really made from African steel.
But it's so much beyond simple steel. I mean, there's agriculture.
And you have also breakthroughs and a whole range of other things. We find an astronomical observatory 300 years before Christ in northwest Kenya, a place called Namortunga, where we found the Africans 300 years before Christ had built an observatory. And they had aligned their stones to a range of stars and constellations on the basis of which they had built one of the most accurate of prehistoric calendars. We find breakthroughs in agriculture. We find, for example, apart from the breakthroughs in agriculture, we find that they had mastered about 1,000 medicinal uses of plants. We find breakthroughs in cattle rearing. We find earlier cattle rearing than anywhere else. We find, for example...
Now, given the destruction of that ancient civilization by the slave trade, it must have been very difficult to actually conduct the kind of research that has produced this kind of evidence. I mean, how have scholars gone about unearthing these new facts that
because
until now...
they picked up bits and pieces like Schmidt and Avery. I think it was Peter Schmidt who was first in the field with regard to metallurgy. He's not a metallurgist, he's not an engineer, he just kept hearing stories. So then he called in an engineer, Avery, and Avery was the person who actually found some of these machines, had them reconstructed, checked out the smelt. They found 13 of these machines in Iron Age strata. So it was not something that they just suddenly fell upon, you know. And you find, for example, Lynch and Robbins of Michigan State coming upon Namortunga. You hear stories and you just think it's fantasy or fiction, and then you go to check and then you discover these things. We discovered, for example, Africans are responsible for lots of breakthroughs in medicine.
Caesarean sections.
The caesarean section in particular, where the caesarean section led to fatalities, 100% fatalities in Europe, until they heard of successful operations in certain parts of Africa, the Baganda of Uganda, and Dr. Felkin and his team went out to check on what these Africans were doing so right that they were doing so wrong. They found that they had superior anesthetics. Now, this is not true of all Africa because things happen in specific places and later on they may spread. But they found that they had superior anesthetics, that the woman remained conscious during the operation. She only cried out once when the baby had been removed and they were to put spikes in to stitch her back. Then she cried out. Then they found they had superior antiseptics. This was a major thing that Lister only introduced antiseptics in the operating theaters in Europe 2 years before.
Now, when would have this been? What kind of time period were
This
we
is
talking about
about
this kind of medical?
1881 that the team, the Falcon team, went in, but the Africans were doing it before then.
Right.
It's only in 1881 that the British team went in to check on this.
And saw
Yes.
this. Now, probably your most controversial thesis was that Africans, black Africans, came to North America before Columbus.
Yes.
Give us some insight into that research
But
that increasingly caused you to come to that
That's extremely
conclusion.
interesting because I actually began 26 years ago attacking this thesis. Because being trained at School of Orient and African Studies, which is where we were led to do studies of primitives, all this was very strange to me. So when I came here, and the very next day I came to this country, I read this book, African, The Discovery of America by Lewin, and I thought it was madness. I was very impressed by the linguistics because I was both a linguist and anthropologist at the time. I was very impressed by the how could you have such coincidences? But I actually wrote an article attacking this thesis, and I ended by saying if anyone could show me just one image of an African in America before Columbus, I would begin to believe. And I sent it off to Random House. Charles Harris was the editor of some magazine, Amistad 2. And he called me the week later and he said, Van Sertima, something strange has happened in my table. He said, if anyone could show me the image of an African in America before Columbus. And that was the last sentence in your paper, and I turned it over, and there were 6 images of African America before Columbus, because John Williams, the novelist, had met some strange German who was last of the royal family of Germany, and he had spent many years in excavations, etc., and they come up with these heads. So I then flew to Mexico to see von Lutenau. We became great friends. Every year I would go into a different field, into botany, into linguistics, and found that all sorts of things connected. Then I was surprised to find after about 5 years that I had collected 12 Europeans. The names of 12 Europeans who had actually seen or heard of blacks when they came. And that Christopher Columbus was the first of these. Christopher Columbus actually wrote in the Journal of the Second Voyage that when he was in Haiti, Native Americans came to them and told them that black-skinned people had come in large boats trading in gold-tipped metal spears. Columbus took 2 of these spears and sent them back to Spain to be assayed. They were microscopically inspected in Spain. And then they found that of 32 parts, 18 were gold, 6 of silver, and 8 of copper. That's identical with spears being forged in African Guinea. And all the songs that the Native Americans were using for these spears are the same songs that the Africans were using, Ghana and Kane and Kani and Ganin, etc. The Americans had added one word, Ganini, the gold merchants, which referred to the Africans bringing in these things. And then I found Ferdinand Columbus wrote a book on his father. He said, my father told me he saw Negroes north of Honduras. And then I found that Vasco Nunez de Balboa on September 25th in the year 1513, coming down the slopes of Caracua, which is in Darien, which we now call Panama, actually saw 2 tall black men among the Native Americans. The Spanish were startled. These men were about 1.5 feet taller than the Native American. They were exceedingly black. They had a different texture of hair, different features, and they asked the Native Americans where these black men come from, and they said, we don't know, but they're in a large settlement nearby, and we're waging war with them, and we've captured these 2. Several people commented that. Peter Martyr, one of the first historians of America, said that these black people must have been shipwrecked long ago from Africa and had taken refuge in these mountains.
Now, it begs the obvious question is, why do we know nothing of this? Why do we have to have this television interview to find these remarkable stories and facts?
Because the problem is that if you have a certain frozen vision about the people and you find an odd bit of information here, you're not going to follow it up and find that there's a whole lot of odd bits of information, because it's impossible to believe. It's like believing that other human beings went to the moon before us, okay? Because so that if you heard about that, the whole thing becomes ridiculous.
But I mean, you are highly respected as you know, as a scholar from Rutgers and Princeton University. But there are others who are out there within the Afrocentric movement who are saying that Napoleon shot the nose off the Sphinx because it had Negroid qualities, and that Cleopatra was black. Why have some kind of forced the facts almost beyond the pale and doing it, discrediting the more scholarly work?
That is a tragedy that happens perhaps in all movements. This is what has led to. Some of the colonial political movements, for example, have been destroyed by extremism, where you have a responsible body of people making a forward movement, and then other elements come up, and they think that it's necessary to exaggerate or invent. I mean, Cleopatra is probably mixed. She has some black blood, but she's probably
as Egypt
mixed.
appeared to be at that point in time.
And it's not important. I mean, who was Cleopatra? She never did anything of consequence. She was probably a great lover. So I mean, I really find it incredible that
and all the work in the sub-Sahara now that shows that the civilizations were not just restricted to Egypt, which we know about, I think, as evidence.
And also that we have found, in the case of Egypt, we have found, for example, the Americans found that in 1962, that the pharaohs were not born in Egypt at all. Keith Seal and his team discovered pharaohs in Nubia before Egypt. Okay, and we have found many things coming up from inner Africa. That is one of the new startling discoveries, that we find about 22 plants. 22 plants or parts of plants that turn up in Egypt that come from inner Africa. We also find a whole range of other things coming up into Egypt. We found, for example, at Zaire, some kind of mathematical thing which turns up later in one of the mathematical papyri of Egypt. So we're finding that you have, I prefer to call it inner Africa rather than Africa south of the Sahara, because it involves more than south of the Sahara coming up into Egypt. Now the unfortunate thing is that in the study of Egypt, people get involved with minor issues like, who on earth is Cleopatra? I mean, why does that matter? So that you will find people will start introducing irrelevant nonsense like that, and then people can attack it very easily, and then they blow the whole thing up.
Right. Now, but one part of Afrocentrism that does seem to be fairly central is this notion of a stolen legacy, that there's been a systematic attempt by white European societies to, steal African culture and then kind of destroy evidence of its existence. How far do you buy into that notion?
Well, you see, part of it is true, because the important thing was that it was necessary for us, if you have a Christian conscience, okay, it becomes necessary in order to assuage that conscience, to pretend or to assume or to invent in your mind that these really are inferior people and that we're doing good to them by dragging them up into civilization, so that you have all sorts of motives.
The white man's burden.
Yes. You see, because we find, for example, the names of the slave ships. Jesus, good intent, justice. I mean, that's schizophrenia. I mean, and you have people sitting on the slave ships writing hymns like, Jesus, you lover of my soul. So that it became, it's a, I don't know how to put it, but there's some sort of madness that entered into that period. The important thing now is for us to, seeing the tragedy that it has brought into our world, the important thing for us is to find ways to bring about a balance and to shatter the frozen vision. My intention of my work is to show that Africans were not the primitives we thought they were, and to try and show as responsibly as possible what were their contributions to civilization.
In your public lectures, I mean, you also focus a lot on modern-day black accomplishments in North America post-slave trade. I mean, everything from the invention of the steam engine to the typewriter to current developments in the space program. Again, why do we just know about Marcus Garvey and peanuts and nothing else about black accomplishments in modern history?
Yeah, that was one of the most exciting parts of my exploration of this, because I went to NASA to study what blacks were doing in space, and was startled to find that the leading technical astronaut in our space team is an African American, Colonel Gregory. And I was very fortunate because when I first went to NASA, they thought it was just a study of equal opportunity and things like that. And I insisted, no, I want to see the scientists. And that was extremely interesting because I actually sat in a spaceship. I managed to see a whole lot of things. Then NASA flew me to witness the blast off of the first black in space. And one discovered a whole range of things. I met Dr. Christine Darden, the leading woman at NASA, who is an African American. She is now reshaping our planes so that we could fly faster than sound without the sonic boom problem. That's a very serious problem for us because the sonic boom can shatter eardrums and glass for miles around. But as you pointed out at the beginning of this question, that a range of things. By the year 1913, more than 1,000 inventions were patented by African Americans. We know nothing of this. So
and to your audience who listens to this, they would say not only are these remarkable accomplishments, but they must say, why don't we know anything about this?
Well, I often wonder about that, but I think just as we have this frozen vision that makes us only see one side of Africa. So many of us grew up despising Africa. And there's also the frozen vision that blocks out achievements of African Americans. People get involved in things like music, you know, and sports, and they're not aware that African Americans have been deeply involved in science and have made breakthroughs in so many fields.
Well, within the whole area of Afrocentrism, there's a very bitter scholarly debate saying that Afrocentrism has two purposes. One is to solid historic scholarship, but the other is to create a historical root and source of black pride, and that the two get mixed up all the time. Yeah. Is that the case in terms of your colleagues and looking at the body of work that's out there?
I think there are some people who invent or exaggerate or at least put an emphasis on things that do not that are not of any significance. For example, I remember a friend of mine whom I shall not name. He suffered enough. I always warned him. When I was at NASA, I was told about something quite extraordinary. I can't remember what it was. Oh yes, NASA told me that in Egypt, about 2,300 BC or something like that, they found a glider.
I remember reading this, yes.
They found this glider. It didn't have an engine, but it was not a toy. They said it had aerodynamic qualities. I told him, I said, be very careful with this information. This is not on the level of the Wright brothers, but 2,300 BC is not a joke. These guys were actually experimenting. Right. I made it quite clear, experimenting.
With flight.
Yes, and he went about saying about how the Nubians were gliding from here to there. He lost his job. Because the New York Times called me and said, we were aware that you were quite responsible, that you're very cautious, that you don't say anything without backup, but wouldn't you admit that in your movement there are lots of irresponsible or incautious souls? Those words, incautious. I said, I don't have a movement. I'm alone. I don't have a movement. There is a movement going on, and there are some responsible people and irresponsible people. There are some remarkable people who are bringing forward this information. There are quite a number of them who are really quite remarkable, who have done work as significant as I have, like Dr. Charles Finch, for example, in the field of medicine. And they said, but wouldn't you admit they're incautious souls? I said, I don't know what you're talking about, because this is not the movement. This was February, about 5 or 6 years ago. Opened the paper one Sunday in February, and here is this thing by the New York Times about, they interviewed Van Sertima and something about incautious souls, and one such incautious soul was such and such, who was talking about Egyptians gliding from here. He lost his job.
Now, do you think that is an attempt to overcompensate to the slave history that is the dominant part of black history for modern black North Americans? That's all they know about their history is slavery?
Yeah, it is very unfortunate, but that the people are driven at times because of the enormous sense of non-achievement that is being presented by this frozen vision. But you see, it is equally reprehensible for people, even after finding out new facts, still to stick to the frozen vision that Africans are inferior and things like that. It's so unfortunate because it's a case of ignorant armies clash by night. You see, so that, I mean, one has to be extremely careful about that, and when it appears, one has to point to it. Which is sometimes is very difficult because you don't want to hurt people. Mm-hmm. You know, I spoke to him privately. I said, be very careful, don't say such things. And I was having a debate with some professors once in Chicago, and this gentleman got up and said, we were talking about the pyramids and the problems involved in the building of the pyramids, and he got up and said, but how do we know? Since we do not know all the ways in which pyramids were built, how do we know that the Egyptians were not levitating the stones? And I went over to him and I said, shut up, man, don't make a fool of yourself. The Russians have shown, I had to dissociate myself from him. I said, the Russians have shown in recent experiments that you can move a small object. With certain kinds of concentration, you can move a small object, but this is an experimental stage. We have absolutely no scientific proof that man could levitate large blocks of stone. So that until we have absolute proof of that, it would be most unwise to talk about such things.
The Egyptians had abilities of telekinesis, of course.
Yeah.
But as the body of evidence starts to become overwhelming, that there really truly was a very rich civilization in ancient Africa, not just in Egypt, but also the sub-Sahara. Do you think the time will come then when black Americans will start focusing on their modern heroes and not have to look back to Africa?
Well, they have a number of modern heroes, but it's necessary that that past should be recovered, because it's not as easy as in the case of the European element in America, where they don't have to. Europe has been looking back for centuries, because all the things we learned in school was about Europe. You know, when I went to university, the School of Oriental and African Studies, for example, I went with the hope that I would be able to repair this gap in me. I knew nothing about Africa. So I decided to do a degree in African Studies. All the studies of Africa were of primitives. It was just as bad as some of these extremists who were inventing things. It was very depressing. At the end of the first year, I tried to commit suicide. I drank poison. But I was unconscious for about 3 days. The doctor said I had drunk enough poison to kill 3 Englishmen, and they did not understand how I could recover from those poisons.
But Guyanese immunization
No,
system,
it wasn't Guyanese, it was forest. I had spent quite a lot of time in the forest, and we were injected with all sorts of things, with snake poison, all sorts of things like that. So somehow I had developed immunity to a whole lot of things by having poisons injected into me in small quantities. I don't know what it was, but I did survive. But I can see that frozen vision and all the kinds of myths that were perpetrated, and because of that frozen vision, created a state of mind that filled me with enormous anxiety for years. So that the point at issue is that once vision ceases to be frozen, and one becomes more fluid again, and one begins to accept that there's a great part of the world that we don't know about, or that we have closed off, that I think something significant can begin to happen. Because you see, America is still the leading country in the world. It's still the richest, the most powerful. But it has a problem that could destroy it. We are facing homogeneous giants in the East, Japan and China, that do not have these racial problems. And unless we solve these problems, we are in grave danger, because we could sabotage ourselves. So that I think it is critical that this knowledge should be handled in a certain way. While it may give pride to African Americans, which it should not lead to racial chauvinism, because one racial chauvinism chauvinism versus another racial chauvinism is not going to solve the
Just
problem.
one other different kind of frozen vision.
Yes.
Well, Ivan von Sertima, I mean, this is absolutely remarkable work you're doing, and that for someone who knows nothing about it at all, I find I'm a better person for having learned. I want to thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.